Hey, U.S. history students, we've got a test coming up over World War II. So we're going to spend a few minutes today reviewing everything we've learned about World War II. So if you've got your study guide with you, now would be a great time to get it out and let's walk through it together. So first of all, as you know, watching a little video, reviewing with me, although I'm happy to do it, it's not any sort of substitute for actually reading your textbook. So, as always, this is not an exhaustive list, so please do complete all assigned reading. But let's run through as quickly as we can some of the main ideas that we need to know about the Second World War. So, first of all, you need to remember the United States of America was an isolationist country in the 1930s. We can see that through the Neutrality Act, which prevented the United States from selling weapons or getting involved with any sort of belligerent country that was at war. And this makes sense because, after all, those ties to countries at war is what helped to bring the United States into World War One, which, remember, was supposed to be the war to end all wars. However, after war breaks out, it's obvious that the British need help, that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis have taken over the majority of Europe, and we begin to modify our laws to allow us to help the British. First, with cash and carry, we said, hey, Britain, you can buy weapons from us, but you have to pay us cash and you have to come get them. We're not taking them to you. Later, through Lend Lease, when the British run out of cash and they can't pay cash for weapons anymore, we begin to lend weapons to the British. All of this is getting the United States pretty close to direct involvement with Germany. And this is why President Roosevelt gives his famous four freedom speech: freedom of speech everywhere in the world, freedom of religion everywhere in the world, freedom from fear, freedom from want everywhere in the world. This speech is given to try to convince the American people that it is in America's interest to support the British. But not everyone agreed, of course. We talked about the America First Committee that was headed up by people like Charles Lindbergh. It was an isolationist group, did not want the United States to get involved in the war, did not want the United States to help the British in their fight against the Axis powers. Who are the Axis powers? Well, let's start first with Italy. Italy it has the dictator Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, who is really the founder of fascism. What is fascism? Well, fascism is a form of government that is incredibly nationalistic, extreme nationalism, ruled by a dictator, very strongly anti-communist, plays upon national pride and things of that nature. Um, Fascism is what we call it in Italy, but kind of a subcategory of that, of course, is Nazism, which we see in Germany. Bad economic conditions, bad situations helps to lead to bad people coming to power. So Hitler comes to power in Germany partly because he played on Germany's pride and national unity and all that, wanted to restore Germany to its former glory. But also, the economy was simply awful. The economy was terrible, a remnant of World War One, a remnant of the Treaty of Versailles. And these bad conditions allow people to look to Hitler, who promises to make everything better. And of course, at the heart of that, of course, is anti-Semitism. That's not why he came to power, but he is able to exploit that as he tries to put in place his plans to unite all German-speaking people, to rebuild the German Empire, the Reich, to give the Germans living space. All of this sort of stuff he is going to attempt to do. And the scapegoat for all of Germany's problems to Adolf Hitler are the Jewish people. A nonsensical argument, but the argument that he makes. And we see that through the Nuremberg laws. And Nuremberg laws strip Jewish individuals of German citizenship and prevent them from taking certain jobs, things of that nature. Hitler wants to create a master race, an Aryan race, and he believes this Aryan race is superior to all people, right? And the Jewish people are not part of that. We see this even worse with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where there's widespread anti-Jewish violence spurred on by the Nazis. And then they use this event to further oppress the Jewish people by putting them in ghettos and things of that nature. Eventually, over time, This will lead to the final solution. Hitler's final solution for the problem that he faced was, of course, the Holocaust, the rounding up of Jewish people and others and sending them to concentration camps to ultimately die. Many people wonder why the United States and other Western countries did not do more to help. Well, the sad truth is that even though there was some desire to help, it wasn't universal. And there were certainly groups in the United States of America and other places that did not want to welcome Jewish refugees. And sadly, we can see this with the SS St. Louis, a ship full of Jewish refugees that come to our shores and are turned away. And sadly, many of the people on that ship go back to Europe and are victims of the final solution. There are a few examples of the United States and others helping. President Roosevelt's War Refugee Board did have limited success in helping Jewish refugees, but on the whole, not a whole lot is done. And it's not until the end of the war that the horrors of this are really realized. Moving over to the Pacific theater, let's talk about Japan. Why did Japan begin invading neighbors and building empire? A lot of it's about resources. The Japanese had a view that they were racially superior to all other Asian countries, and they looked at places like Manchuria, which they invade to get the resources to fuel their industrial machine and their war machine, but also many of the other European colonies that were there as well. And reason why they attacked Pearl Harbor is because, frankly, the United States was the only military presence in the Pacific that could do anything to stop them if we chose to. And so the idea was knock the United States out, take out our ability to fight a war, and then the Japanese can build their empire. Moving back over to Europe, the Munich Conference. Remember, the event that sparked the outbreak of war in Europe was Hitler's invasion of Poland, but that's not where his expansion starts. Remember, he annexed Austria, he moved into the Rhineland, all these sort of things. And a lot of that he does because of appeasement, which we see at the Munich Conference. At the Munich Conference, Hitler made demands for the Sudetenland, a German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia. And there at Munich, the British and the French give in to those demands, appeasement, believing that if they give in little by little to Hitler's requests, that they could prevent the outbreak of war. That, of course, did not happen. And the reason why the British and the French realized that their appeasement had failed is not long after Hitler takes the Sudetenland. He takes all of Czechoslovakia, and then he begins making demands for Poland. And of course, again, it is that invasion of Poland that sparks the outbreak of war. Prior to the invasion of Poland, Hitler, a Nazi, makes a deal with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union for a non-aggression pact. Despite the fact, again, that fascists, Nazis are strongly anti-communist, which Joseph Stalin is, they both want to do bad things. And so the non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler allowed for Hitler to invade Poland and also gave Stalin permission to essentially take another portion of Poland. They kind of divided it up. It's not long after this, within a few months, Hitler's armies, using their blitzkrieg, their lightning warfare, they overwhelm the Netherlands, they overwhelm Belgium, and ultimately they overwhelm France in June of 1940. And the only thing left standing between Hitler and all domination of all of Europe, of course, is Great Britain. Hitler would have liked to invade Britain, but he's unable to. The Battle of Britain is when the Royal Air Force, the RAF, night after night after night, go into the sky to fight back against the Nazi planes that are coming in, and ultimately the RAF prevents an invasion of Great Britain. You and I, of course, know that the United States is slow to get into the war, and it is Pearl Harbor that we talked about earlier that brings us into the war. We join up with Great Britain, and ultimately we join up with the other big member of the Allies, and that is the Soviet Union. Not because we like the Soviet Union, but because Hitler breaks his non-aggression pact in 1941 and invades the Soviet Union. So now the United States is allied with Great Britain and all of their Commonwealth countries and the Soviet Union. And we fight first in North Africa, then we invade Sicily. But ultimately, after a meeting at Tehran, the Tehran Conference, a decision is made to open a second front in Europe. And the United States of America, along with the British and the Canadians, invade at Normandy, the D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious invasion in world history. And it is led by Dwight Eisenhower, who is the supreme Allied commander. That invasion at Normandy will ultimately lead to the liberation of France and then the push toward Germany from the West by the Americans and the British. The last-ditch effort by the Nazis to stop the Allies from invading Germany, of course, is the Battle of the Bulge, where they throw all their forces that are aligned, but the line bends but does not break, creates a bulge. But after that victory for the United States, it's only a matter of time before Germany is defeated, which ultimately was the goal. Because, of course, at the beginning of the war, by the beginning of American involvement, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain agreed that the vast majority of Americans' efforts should be focused on defeating Hitler and that the Japanese would be on the back burner. So we will get to the Japanese in a moment. After the defeat of the Nazis, there is a meeting at Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference after the defeat of the Nazis. And this is where the United States meets with a new president, Harry Truman, meets with Prime Minister Churchill and Joseph Stalin. They discuss what's going to happen. There have been earlier meetings at places like Yalta, but ultimately the decision is made to divide Germany between all the Allied forces, to divide it up and occupy it, to put the Nazi leaders on trial at the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, the first time that the international justice had been used to hold leaders accountable. At the Yalta Conference previously, they established the United Nations, an international peacekeeping body that was basically trying to do what the League of Nations could not. But disputes over how to handle Germany and the rest of Europe will lead to the Cold War that we will talk about later. Moving over to the Pacific theater, again, Japan was on the back burner, but that doesn't mean that there was nothing going on, obviously. The Battle of the Coral Sea is a big victory for the United States and the Australians that stopped Japanese advance toward Australia. It's actually the first naval battle in world history where the two navies with their ships never fire at one another. They don't see one another. Instead, all the fighting is done from planes taking off of aircraft carriers. So we're seeing a real difference in the way naval wars are fought. Ultimately, the way we're going to get to Japan, which is our ultimate goal, to defeat the Japanese, is through island hopping, one by one by one, going from one small island to another small island, so that we can build airstrips and get closer and closer and closer in order to eventually be able to maybe launch an invasion, but certainly bomb the main Japanese islands. That's the purpose of Iwo Jima, an island that probably would have gone to obscurity, except for the fact that its strategic location means that if the United States can control it, they can use it to launch bombing raids on Japan. What the United States discovers is that fighting in the Pacific and taking these islands is going to come at a terrible, terrible cost. Huge amounts of casualties. At Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, it's at Okinawa that the Japanese resort to kamikaze pilots, suicide bombers, where they fly their planes into our ships. All of this is showing the incredibly high cost of war in the Pacific. While all the war is going on, however, there is the Manhattan Project, a secret plan in the United States to develop the world's first atomic bomb, a nuclear weapon. And ultimately, that nuclear weapon will be used by the United States to end the war with Japan. President Truman, when he learns about it and we successfully tests it in 1945, he gives the order to drop it on two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb ends World War II. The Japanese finally surrender after seeing what the United States is capable of. It's a very controversial thing that people have debated many years. Is it ever justified to do this? But of course, President Truman's justification, the reason he gave, was he believed it would save American lives. Save American lives if we use the atomic bomb. But ultimately, it does, of course, end the Second World War. Quickly, let's take a look at the home front. We've talked about the military side. What's going on at home? A few experiences we need to be aware of. War experiences of women in the United States. The need for labor allows for huge numbers of American women to enter into manufacturing, heavy industry for the first time. We see this with Rosie the Riveter and things like that. But also the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, these sort of things. Women are in the military in non-combat roles. Native Americans. World War II is the first time that large numbers of Native Americans move off of reservations, and they do that looking for the many jobs that the war creates. Many others serve in the armed forces and certainly make incredibly valuable contributions as code talkers, using their native language to transmit war messages that the Japanese could never break. For African Americans, many were engaged in what was called the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign was victory over Hitler's racism, fascism abroad, and victory over racism at home. And African Americans, of course, play a vital role in winning the war overseas and contributing here at home, where labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph put pressure on President Roosevelt to make sure there was measures were taken to prevent discrimination within hiring practices within war industries. For Mexican immigrants, we have the Bracero program. Bracero program is when the United States calls up Mexico and said, please send many laborers to the West to work in agriculture. There's such a demand for jobs. And so many Mexican immigrants come over through this agreement to work in the West. For Japanese Americans, they, of course, have a very unique and tragic story. Anti-Japanese hysteria following the attack on Pearl Harbor led the United States to take really irrational steps. In fact, President Roosevelt issues an executive order number 9066 in early 1942 that had all Japanese Americans, people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast of the United States, summarily rounded up and sent to internment camps with no trial, with no due process, simply because of what they look like. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children are sent to these internment camps. And when this goes to court, how is this possible? How can you legally do such a thing? In the case Korematsu versus United States, the Supreme Court actually determined in that case that it was in fact constitutional for the president, as a matter of national security, to round people up with no trial. Not one of the United States' better moments. Years down the road, in the 1990s, the government apologized for this action. They paid some reparations, but of course that does not undo what was done. Wars are, in fact, really expensive. The United States spends a ton of money during World War II. In fact, the war and all the government spending and putting people to work, both in the military and outside of it, does, in fact, end the Great Depression. It is World War II that ends the Great Depression, not the New Deal. So where do we get all that money? Well, of course, we tax a lot of people and things of that nature. We raise taxes, but the biggest chunk of the money we get, we borrow. We borrow money through the sign of war bonds and things like that. So there's a lot of debt associated with this. But of course, the United States is in debt to the men and women who serve this country. And so the GI Bill is passed at the end of the war. The GI Bill allows for free education for those who have served in the war. The GI Bill allows for low interest loans for veterans coming home to buy houses and businesses and things of that nature. And so the GI Bill is something that's created toward the end of the war to essentially thank our veterans for what they did in that war, and that has persisted. It wasn't a short-term thing. It existed for many years, and still to this day, people take advantage of this because, of course, if someone is willing to put their life on the line in service of the country, then having their health care and their education taken care of seems like a reasonable thing to many Americans. Okay, so there you go. Again, we covered a lot of material today. I know this was exciting, but this should not be a substitute for making sure you completed all reading. Make sure you fill out that study guide, you turn it in. You're going to do great on the upcoming test. All right. If this was helpful to you, then you know what you got to do. You got to like the video, and maybe I'll make more of them in the future.